The respiratory system. Respiration, which means breathe again, is the exchange of gases between the body and the environment. Respiration supplies the cells of the body with oxygen and rids them of carbon dioxide. The process of respiration includes breathing, gas exchange between the lungs and the blood, transport of gases through the body by the blood, gas exchange between the blood and the cells, and cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is the process by which cells capture energy from nutrients that serve as fuel molecules. Oxygen is required for cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product. The next several slides have different medical terms for the respiratory system. You will have time in class to make flashcards for these. These are some common abbreviations for the respiratory system and some additional common abbreviations for the respiratory system. The respiratory system works with the cardiovascular system to supply body cells with oxygen and remove carbon dioxide. The cells of the human body require a constant supply of oxygen. Carbon dioxide waste must be removed. The transportation of oxygen and subsequent removal of carbon dioxide between the lungs and body cells is accomplished by the cardiovascular system. The respiratory system consists of the lungs and the airway, a series of tubes through which air flows to and from the air sacs of the lung. As a breath of air enters the nostrils, the openings of the nose, it flows through the nasal cavities to the pharynx, through the larynx or voice box, and into the trachea or windpipe. Air then enters the right or left primary bronchus. One bronchus enters each lung. After passing through the smaller branches of the bronchi, air flows through the bronchioles. The bronchioles divide again and again until air reaches the microscopic air sacs called alveoli. Oxygen diffuses from the air sacs into the blood. Air enters through the nasal cavity where it is warm, filtered, and moistened. From there, the air passes through the pharynx or the throat. Then the air passes through the larynx or the voice box. The nasal cavity, the throat, and the voice box make up the upper respiratory tract. Next, air travels through the trachea or windpipe. The trachea divides into the primary bronchi that enter each lung. Air then enters the bronchioles in the lung. The lungs are filled with air sacs or alveoli that exchange gases with the environment. The lower respiratory tract is made up of the trachea, the primary bronchi that enter each lung, the bronchioles in the lung, and then the air sacs or the alveoli which exchange gases with the environment. This picture here is just a visual of the upper and lower respiratory tract. So you have the nasal cavity, the throat, and the voice box in the upper respiratory tract. And the lower respiratory tract consists of the trachea, the primary bronchi that enters each lung, and then the lungs or the alveoli. Couple different parts of the nasal cavities. Air passes into the nose through its two openings, the nostrils, also called the nares. Coarse hairs in the nostrils prevent large particles from entering the nose. The nostrils open into two nasal cavities, which are separated by a partition, the nasal septum. The nasal septum and the walls of the nose consist of bone covered with a mucous membrane. Three bony projections, the nasal conchae, extend into the nasal cavities from the lateral walls of the nose. They increase the surface area over which air passes as it moves through the nose. As air passes through the nose, it is filtered, moistened, and brought to body temperature due to a mucous membrane lining that has a rich blood supply. Inhaled dirt and other foreign particles are trapped in the layer of mucus that forms along the surface of the mucous membrane. Ciliated epithelial cells of the membrane push a steady stream of mucus along with its trapped particles toward the throat. The mucus is swallowed with saliva. In this way, foreign particles are delivered to the digestive system. Several paranasal sinuses, or small cavities in the bones of the skull, communicate with the nasal cavities by small channels. They are lined with mucous membranes. When you breathe through your nose or your mouth, air finds its way into the pharynx or throat because posteriorly the nasal cavities are continuous with the throat. As air enters the nasal pharynx, which is the superior part of the pharynx, and then moves down into the oropharynx, which is behind the mouth, and then it passes through the laryngopharynx. Posterior to the opening into the larynx, a second opening in the laryngopharynx leads into the esophagus, which is part of the digestive tract. The larynx opens at the glottis. It consists of vocal cords, which are muscular folds of tissue that project into the larynx from its lateral walls. The vocal cords vibrate as air from the lung rushes past them during expiration or breathing out. The epiglottis is a flap of tissue that automatically closes off the larynx during swallowing, so food and water do not enter the lower airway. The wall of the larynx is supported by cartilage that protrudes from the midline of the neck and is sometimes referred to as an Adam's apple. The Adam's apple is more prominent in males than in females. And this is just a visual of the larynx and pharynx, their relationship on the left, and on the right, it's just the anterior view of the larynx. The trachea is also known as the windpipe. It's located anterior to the esophagus, and it's kept from collapsing by rings of cartilage in its wall. The larynx, trachea, and bronchi are lined by a mucous membrane that traps dirt and other foreign matter. Ciliated cells in the lining continuously beat a stream of mucus upward to the pharynx, where the mucus is swallowed. The trachea divides into the right and left primary bronchi. One bronchus enters each lung. Inside the lung, each bronchus branches again and again like branches of trees. These branches give rise to smaller and smaller bronchi, and finally to very small bronchioles. Each lung has more than 1 million bronchioles. This network of branching air passageways within the lungs is referred to as the bronchial tree. The lungs are large, paired organs that occupy the thoracic cavity. They are separated medially by the mediastinum, the middle part of the thoracic cavity, which contains the heart, esophagus, thymus gland, and parts of other organs. The right lung is divided into 3 lobes. The left lung has 2 lobes. The hilus is the depression where each primary bronchus enters its lung. A pleural membrane is a sac enclosing the lung, and it continues as the lining of the thoracic cavity. The parietal pleura is the part of the pleural membrane that lines the thoracic cavity. The pleural membrane is a serous membrane. It lines the body cavity and does not open up to the outside of the body. The pleural cavity is a potential space between the visceral and parietal pleura. The visceral pleura is the part of the pleural membrane that covers the lung. The thoracic cavity is completely enclosed. It is bounded on the front and sides by the chest wall, which contain ribs. Its floor is a strong, dome-shaped muscle called the diaphragm. Each terminal bronchiole leads into a cluster of microscopic air sacs called alveoli. They stretch and contract during breathing. Pulmonary surfactant is a substance that coats the alveoli and prevents them from collapsing. The wall of an alveolus consists of a single layer of epithelial cells and elastic fibers, which permit it to stretch and contract during breathing. Each alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries, allowing gases to diffuse easily between the alveoli and the blood. Respiration includes 4 separate events. First is pulmonary ventilation, which is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. This is normally accomplished by breathing. Next is external respiration, and that is the exchange of gases between the alveoli and the blood. Next is respiratory gas transport, which was when oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported by the bloodstream. And finally, internal respiration, which is exchanging gases between blood and tissue cells. Breathing depends on volume changes in the thoracic cavity. Inspiration is the process of taking air into the lungs or breathing in, inspiration in. Expiration is the process of breathing out. The thoracic cavity is closed, so no air can enter except through the trachea. During inspiration, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, and the external intercostal muscles contract. As the diaphragm contracts, it moves downward, and as the external intercostal muscles contract, they pull each rib up and out. These actions increase the size of the chest cavity. As the chest cavity expands, the film of fluid on the pleural membranes holds the lung surfaces against the chest wall. As a result, the lungs move outward along with the chest wall. The space within each lung increases. The air in the lungs at first tends to spread out to fill the larger space. However, the pressure of the air in the lungs falls below the pressure of air outside the body. This creates a partial vacuum. As a result, air from the outside rushes in through the respiratory passageways and fills the lungs until the two pressures are again equal. During deeper inspiration, additional muscles contract. Expiration occurs when the diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relax, permitting the elastic tissues of the lung to recoil. The size of the thoracic cavity decreases, increasing the pressure inside the lung. As pressure increases, elastic fibers push against the air, forcing it to rush out of the lung. The millions of alveoli deflate, and the lung is ready for another inspiration. During forced expiration, also called active expiration, several sets of muscles contract, including the internal intercostal muscles. Pressure in the space between the visceral and parietal pleural is lower than atmospheric pressure. This pressure difference prevents the air sacs from completely deflating at the end of each expiration. We'll have more information on inspiration and expiration on upcoming slides. With inspiration, the inspiratory muscles, which are the diaphragm and the external intercostals, contract. The size of the thoracic cavity increases. The intrapulmonary pressure is reduced, and air flows into the lungs from the area of higher pressure outside the body. With expiration, the inspiratory muscles relax. The size of the thoracic cavity decreases. Interpulmonary pressure increases. Air flows out of the lungs from the area of high pressure inside the body. During expiration, there's pulmonary gas exchange. Deoxygenated blood from the heart enters the lungs. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood into the alveoli to be exhaled. Oxygen diffuses from the blood to the alveoli. Gas exchange occurs by diffusion. Diffusion is the net movement of molecules from a region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Gases are transported by the circulatory system. Breathing delivers oxygen to the alveoli of the lungs. However, if oxygen merely remained in the lungs, all other body cells would die. The vital link between the alveoli and the body cells is the circulatory system. Each alveolus serves as a depot from which oxygen is loaded into the blood of the pulmonary capillaries. Because the alveoli contain a greater concentration of oxygen than the blood entering the pulmonary capillaries, oxygen molecules diffuse from the alveoli into the blood. Carbon dioxide moves from the blood, where it is more concentrated, to the alveoli, where it is less concentrated. Each gas diffuses through the lining of the capillary and the thin lining of the alveolus. When oxygen diffuses into the blood, it enters red blood cells and forms a weak chemical bond with hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin. Because the chemical bond linking the oxygen with the hemoglobin is weak, the reaction is readily reversible. In tissues that are low on oxygen, oxyhemoglobin dissociates, releasing oxygen. The oxygen then diffuses out of the capillaries and into the cells. Carbon dioxide is transported in the blood in 3 ways. A small amount, about 10%, is simply dissolved in plasma. About 30% is transported attached to hemoglobin. Most of the carbon dioxide, about 60%, is transported by bicarbonate ions. Many of these ions diffuse into plasma. Breathing is regulated by the brain. Breathing is a rhythmic, involuntary process regulated by respiratory centers in the brainstem. Groups of neurons in the dorsal region of the medulla regulate the basic rhythm of breathing. These neurons send a burst of impulses to the diaphragm by way of the phrenic nerves and to the external intercostal muscles by way of the intercostal nerves. Respiratory centers in the pons help control the transition from inspiration to expiration. The respiratory centers in the pons can stimulate or inhibit the respiratory centers in the medulla. The cycle of activity and inactivity repeats itself, so at rest we breathe about 14 times per minute. A group of neurons in the ventral region of the medulla become active only when we need to breathe forcefully. Carbon dioxide concentration is the most important chemical stimulus for regulating the rate of respiration. Specialized chemoreceptors, or chemical receptors, in the medulla are sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide concentration. When stimulated, the chemoreceptors signal the respiratory centers, leading to an increase in the respiratory rate. A decrease in carbon dioxide concentration below the homeostatic level has the opposite effects. It inhibits the chemoreceptors, resulting in slower breathing. Chemoreceptors in the walls of the aorta and carotid arteries are also sensitive to changes in carbon dioxide concentration. When CO2 or carbon dioxide increases, the breathing rate increases, and excess carbon dioxide is removed by the lungs. If oxygen concentration falls to the point of being life-threatening, the chemoreceptors in the aorta and carotid arteries become stimulated and signal the respiratory centers to take emergency action. And this is just a graphic that shows what was discussed on the previous slide. Some non-respiratory air movements are reflex or involuntary movements of air. They include sneezing, coughing, crying, laughing, hiccups, and yawning. Respiratory capacity is how much air moves into and out of the lungs under different conditions. It's affected by size, age, gender, and physical condition. Tidal volume is the amount of air that moves into and out of the lungs during normal breathing. It's approximately 500 milliliters. The reserve volumes are the inspiratory reserve volume and the expiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume is the amount of air that can be forcefully exhaled after normal inhalation. It averages between 2,100 and 3,200 mLs. Expiratory reserve volume is also known as residual volume. It's the amount of air that can be forcibly exhaled after normal exhalation. It's what keeps the alveoli inflated. It's approximately 1,200 mLs. Vital capacity is the total amount of air that can be exchanged. Tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume plus the expiratory reserve volume is vital capacity. It's about 4,800 in healthy young males. Respiratory capacities are measured with a spirometer. Some age-related changes to the respiratory system. As people age, they have less efficient ventilation, which leads to less oxygen in the blood. Less efficient ventilation occurs due to lung strength decreasing. They do not expand or contract as easily, and the alveoli becoming less elastic. They don't empty on exhalation. The diaphragm becoming weaker, which makes it harder to expand the chest during inhalation, and the airway becoming less elastic. As people age, lung capacity decreases, which may cause the voice to weaken. The cough reflex becomes less effective, and individuals are more susceptible to respiratory infections. Here are some things that the CNA should report to the RN. They should report persistent cough or nasal congestion, changes in a patient's respirations, so either slowing down or speeding up, any cough that produces sputum that is yellowish, greenish, or pinkish, if a patient has onset of sudden difficulty breathing, any wheezing or gurgling respiration, and if a patient has skin with a blue or gray tinge.